everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Welcome to another recording of the podcast where we don't just talk about anything. We talk about the best thing, and that's behavior analysis and behavior analytic research.
If you just stumbled across this show, you probably could not have predicted what that sentence
It could have been
was about.
anything.
No.
I know. I didn't even know where it was going. You know, the spirit of the podcast.
That's the best way to
moved
do
me.
it, really. Just no plan.
My childhood friend found out that we do this podcast, and then she listened. She's just a fourth grade elementary teacher.
She's just a fourth grade elementary.
No, I mean,
teacher.
but that's what she is.
Yes.
She's not a BCBA, so.
She has other talents.
She's a lot of talents. But her 1.5-year-old son was breaking it down to our intro song.
Oh.
And she sent a video, and he was like, It's very cute. So
it's pretty catchy.
It is.
Very nice. But every week we pick a topic related to the field, and we discuss some research articles all about that topic, just like an old-fashioned journal club. Old-fashioned in the sense of they didn't used to have microphones and record themselves and put it on the internet back in the day when they did their journal clubs. No sirree, Bob. That's not how they did it. What are we doing this week, you might ask, as I vamp for no reason? Why? We're talking about instructional fading.
Yay!
I'm sorry, I thought you were going to have some, like,
it.
you look like you were about to, instructional fading, and then you kind of,
No,
nothing?
not yet.
I hope you have something, because
Not
it's
yet.
going to be a short episode otherwise.
I wanted to get to hear what articles we were going to discuss first.
Oh, okay. Well, so let me tell you what articles we're going to be discussing while we talk about instructional fading. The first is stimulus, in parentheses, instructional, end parentheses, fading during extinction of self-injurious escape behavior by Pace, Iwata, Cowder, Andree, and McIntyre, and that was in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 1993.
Yes,
Ooh, Nirvana was still popular.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. I think so.
Yep, I was 13.
Okay. The next article, Reemergence and extinction of self-injurious escape behavior during stimulus, in parentheses, instructional, end parentheses, fading by Zarcone, Iwata, Smith, Mazaleski, and Lerman. And that was in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 1994. Let's get out of the dark ages and move on to our last article, Differential Reinforcement with and without instructional fading by Ringdahl, Kitsukawa, Andelman, Call, Winborn, Barretto, and Reed. Also in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in the halcyon days of 2002. And those are our articles for tonight. But before we get into those articles, we probably want to do a quick blurb on generally what stimulus fading is.
All right, so I know that these articles call it stimulus fading, and that is actually what it is, which I guess is probably why they put that in the title, but I've never heard it called that outside of the context of these research articles.
I like that they did that, though, because they're like, technically this is stimulus fading, right? Because we're removing all the stimuli and then slowly adding them in, but they're like, but nobody will know what we're talking about, so we better put that instructional in the parentheses so that everyone knows, oh, the stimuli are the tasks.
Yeah.
I like that.
I know, I like that too, and it's I think it was probably their attempt to be conceptually systematic with the research in the literature by calling it stimulus fading.
Mm-hmm.
An interesting thing I noticed, though, is nobody mentions it in the intro. Nobody.
Oh, that's true.
Nobody mentions, like, oh, this is actually called stimulus fading, but we call it instructional fading.
Yeah.
I honestly didn't even notice the parentheses until I was reading those titles just now. I've just been referring to it as instructional fading throughout because that's what we knew we were going to call the episode, and that's what we've been referring it to, while we're doing our prep.
I recognize it.
I did
was
too.
waiting.
It's weird to have a parenthesis in your title.
Yeah.
Or parentheses, and both of them did that. But I think since then, we've pretty much moved past having either one of those words in parentheses, and it's sometimes called instructional fading. I feel like even more commonly, it's called demand fading, but that may really just depend on where you are trained. And then, for me specifically, I did not know it under any of these terms. I was taught that this was called zero baseline.
Oh, I actually learned that from you.
I don't know who I learned it from, but it was part of the culture where I was initially trained, zero baseline.
I have a general sense of like where you were, and I know I'd heard that phrase too, zero baseline. But I very rarely heard that. I think only people who sort of had training in our same organization way back when. Because I haven't heard anyone refer to it
I know.
that way.
I think it's very specific. But if you happen to hear that out there in the world, it's synonymous with instructional or demand fading. And the idea here is very simple. So you're going to see this with behavior that's maintained by escape from demands, because it's a way to manipulate the antecedent conditions surrounding the behavior and thereby reduce problem behavior and then slowly and systematically build demands back in. So if you have a situation such as this, where perhaps there is dangerous behavior that's occurring in the context of demand, you've determined that the function of the behavior is escape, one thing that you can do is take all those demands away and go back to zero demands. And then if you see reduction in problem behavior, you can be fairly certain that you were right about the function.
And treatment is done. You did it, everybody.
Did it,
Congratulations.
You
no
win.
challenging behavior.
Pat yourself on the back. No, and then you can carefully build demands back in as they are tolerated, and you monitor lower rates of problem behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's sort of the basic idea. So the fading is of the demands and or the instructions.
I always got confused with that
Mm-hmm.
because fading always reminds me, I'm like, oh, fading to like something
Fade
lesser.
to black?
Or you're
Yeah, I was
removing,
gonna say
you're
that,
removing
right?
something when you
Removing
fade it. You had a
something.
lot and then you faded away.
Oh,
So there's none
That's what
left.
I always think about it. Yeah, that's what I'm always thinking. But
Well,
it's
don't
the,
confuse everybody.
But it's the exact opposite,
Just like in a movie,
It's fade
you can
in. You
fade
can
in
fade
and
in.
fade out.
or
yeah.
you can fade out.
right?
In this
It's
case, you're
fading in.
fade in.
Mm-hmm.
Fading
It's
in,
fade
guys.
So we want to call it instructional parentheses stimulus parentheses a new parentheses in end parentheses fading.
For clarification.
Brackets, zero baseline. This was my pick of topics. I don't know if we're going to start claiming that, but I did.
Okay. We got outvoted by Diana. We wanted to do instructional fading.
Because I think that it's a really useful topic. And
Mhm.
again, it kind of does go by a couple different names. So you may have seen those terms floating around out there and not be 100% sure what it is. I also think that there's a time and a place to use instructional fading. And I thought it might be useful to highlight what those times and places are.
Mm-hmm. And I think you did a good job, Diana, picking the articles for the episode because it does cover, I'm not going to say the entire gamut, in our hour plus show, but I think it hits on some of the big points related to instructional fading of how does it work, or what are some of the probable mechanisms of how it works, what are some other treatments that you can add instructional fading to either make them better, maybe not make them that much better. In some cases you can. And I think it's a good thing to remember because I know I've seen a lot of people who feel like, all right, well, we can remove these things. They love their antecedent manipulations and they love removing stimuli that will evoke challenging behavior. And then, there's that not always a clarity of how would I proceed from there. Once something works,
Right.
a lot of people, think about, human behavior. Well, now the challenging behavior's gone. So whatever I've done has been negatively reinforced. And what I've done is take away these demands. And to be honest, adding demands is hard on its own. So I'm not in a rush to add them back in. And then you kind of get yourself in that problem of, well, how long is too long? I think we've talked about pairing way back when of how much pairing is too much pairing. Kind of that idea. At some point, you're going to have to come out the other end and come up with some plans to get back to a decent rate of instruction presentation. So
Right.
it's a good review if you don't remember, and a good new skill if you somehow missed this one.
I like to talk about instructional fading because, and I'll talk about this probably when I talk about my article too, but I'll just go ahead and say it. When you have dangerous behavior that's maintained by escape, there are limits to what options you have as far as treatment, right? Because you need to do something that's ideally going to keep everybody safe. And if you want to make a difference, then you need to also eventually teach your client something new.
If you're really lucky, you can put it on extinction and hope that the child goes, "Rats, you got me," and after 2 sessions just says, "No more challenging behavior for me, teacher. This reinforcement you're giving me for getting the right answer sure is swell."
Exactly. It's just as easy as that. You just don't reinforce the problem behavior anymore and continue to present demands. Bada bing, bada boom, you're done.
I love reading that in articles. I'm like, what did that really look like? Show me a picture of what that
Yes,
looked like. Because
right.
I don't think it was as one sentence as you described it to me, researcher.
Done.
Exactly. So there's kind of like two options here, right? So you can make changes to the antecedent conditions surrounding your problem behavior or problem times. such as modifying the demands that are being presented, modifying the environment, or you can make changes on the consequence side, which would be, in this case, doing extinction.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
So you have a behavior that's maintained by escape. Escape is the reinforcer. In order to produce extinction, you would need to break that response-reinforcer relation. And in this case, breaking it would be no longer allowing access to escape when presenting a demand. Now, sure, that all sounds all well and good on paper, but as you're saying, Rob, it is way different to attempt to do that in real life.
Can be super messy. Or not, but it can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you really need to think carefully about whether that's going to be the most appropriate treatment for the client that you're working with, right? Just from a safety perspective, but also extinction in and of itself does not automatically presume that we're also teaching a functional communication response.
Right.
And we absolutely should be. So just going in there, barreling in and saying, we're doing extinction, we're going to sit here at this table, we're going to present the demands, like that's not doing the nuance of behavior analysis that we should be doing. There's many other things that we could be including within that package. First and foremost being teach a way, if escape's valuable to this individual, teach a way for them to ask for a break or ask to escape from that demand.
And
right?
that will not be a component of any of these.
Nope, that's also why I wanted to make sure I said it.
Yeah.
We didn't forget them. They're not in the research articles, so we won't be talking about FCT or delay tolerance training, anything like that.
Nope, but those are also really good strategies that one can and should be using when you're approaching behavior of this magnitude and importance. I'm not sure what else I'm going to say about that. I think that was the main point I wanted to set up here, right? So you have options as far as antecedent side and consequence side, but if you're going to start messing around with extinction on the consequence side, then, it's only extinction if you're successful at preventing escape. And very often, if you're talking about very physical behavior or behavior that's going to potentially produce tissue damage for someone, you're not going to be successful 100% of the time. And then rather than it actually being extinction, you've actually just established a very, very thin schedule of reinforcement for that client, which could make the behavior, depending on which side we're going to fall on the PREE and behavioral momentum perspective, a little bit stronger.
Or weaker.
But that's really a conversation for another time.
Or a different episode.
Right. Given all of that whole package, I think it's important to look at what our options are on the antecedent side to manipulate. Now, instructional fading, in addition to escape extinction, both are not for the faint of heart.
No.
Right? So I don't want to present this as like, oh my gosh, this is like your totally easy alternative to doing escape extinction.
I mean, step one's pretty darn easy.
Right.
But it's actually not that easy. It actually is very challenging to not do anything all day. Right?
It's true.
So if you like, oh yeah, I'm not going to do anything. But then after 3 minutes, you're like, what am I going to do? Right? That's actually hard. To find preferred things all day long is actually incredibly hard.
Thanks, Captain Bringdown.
Yeah, I know.
Sometimes attempting to figure out what are the demands can also be hard too, right?
Yeah.
So things that one might not think would be a demand are in fact a demand. Even just sitting next to someone could be a demand, or trying to get them to talk about their day could be a demand, right? And you think that you're just making small talk.
I'm sure many of you out there have been in the situation of, you know what, we're going to do demand fading. Today we're just going to remove all demands. We'll do it for 2 hours. And you still have these incredibly high rates of challenging in your behavior. And you're like, come on, kid. What's the deal? I took away all the demands. Why?
You thought you did.
You thought you did. But,
You're looking at them.
Oh, yeah.
That is a demand.
They're
at school. I don't want to be here. It's you can't leave.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. So there's those challenges too. And it can be a resource intensive process, right? Like Jackie's saying, maybe you now need to fill this child's or client's day with all types of fun reinforcing activities, and you need to suddenly find more of those. But it also is resource intensive in the sense of that client's time. So once you enter into an instructional fading protocol, you're in it for the long run, right? You say, okay, today is a day. All the demands are coming out. The desk is coming out. The beanbag's going in, right? We're doing it. Once you're at that point, you then are very, very far away from providing instruction for that child. And chances are you're there to be providing education and instruction for that child. So we always want to keep that in mind as our end goal, right? we want to kind of balance, like, yes, escape seems to be important to this individual. I want to teach them how to properly ask for that and access that. But also, our goal here is education, and there are many things that one needs to learn to function within the world, and that's why we go to school. So eventually we need to get back to that point where we're learning new, functional, appropriate, productive things.
Mm.
So once you're back down there at 0 demands, right, you're no longer providing those opportunities for learning new skills. And you kind of need to think about that before you embark on this journey. And you need to most definitely have a plan for how you're going to be getting back to your end goal, whatever that may be.
Mm-hmm. Can't be wishy-washy.
Right? Yeah. And recognizing, too, that it's going to take a long time, most likely. Like, fading takes a long time because you're going to be measuring each day what is the rate that behavior is occurring. You know, ideally, is it lower than the previous day or lower than some set threshold that we have? And every day you're going to be determining what's going to be our schedule for the next day. And it may just be 1 extra demand per hour or per day, depending on the situation. So you could be doing this for a few months before you get back up to where you were previously. And that's if it all works and goes smoothly.
Yeah.
I'm not presenting this as like, this is the easy out. Instructional fading is a very big undertaking. So you have to be kind of prepped and ready for that and ready to see it through to the end if you think that this is the most appropriate strategy for your client.
Okay. Well, let's look at how the research lays out this instructional fading and see what results they got. Spoilers, they were great results. Or we wouldn't be talking about these articles. So, Diana, you've got the ball. Why don't you keep going with our Pace It All study?
Okay, I will just keep right on talking then. So
you can do mine too. I'm fine. I'll just take a nap.
Oh, no. Oh, no, Rob. I know how much you love to talk.
I do.
How did I know?
You put me on extinction, though. I might have a giant burst of talking.
It's impossible.
Okay. You put my behavior talking on extinction.
Oh.
You like this? I just all I had to do was put my finger up, just so everyone in the podcast land knows. I just put my finger up and slowly gestured toward the microphone, and Rob already knew.
Yes,
his folly.
Corrected his
It was an SP.
Subject and verb and object.
The Pace et al. Study is the one that I'm going to go over. It's pretty important, guys. Just going to say, I kind of I think kept the best one for myself, but we can leave that up for debate. The way that they introduce this topic is much how I have already introduced this topic, right? So you have escape maintained, in their case, self-injury. We have a couple options. We can make some manipulations to the antecedent conditions, thereby modifying the establishing operations and reducing the necessity and likelihood that problem behavior will occur. If you would like to escape from demands, and there are no demands, then your chances are you're pretty happy.
I like that.
Actually. I love that.
Me
right?
too.
That's what's called vacation.
But not always.
Without children.
Right. There you go.
There we go. However, what that does not do is break that response reinforcer relation, right? So you're just you're on easy street, you're living large, you got your pina colada, your hammock, your book, you're by the beach, and life is good. So you're not engaging in any escape maintained behavior. However, if a demand were to suddenly come crashing down onto your beach towel, you would respond in the same way that you have previously by engaging in whatever escape response has been maintained in the past, right? So you haven't learned anything new, and the response reinforcer relation that's already established is still present. It just doesn't need to occur under those particular antecedent conditions. The other piece there is, like I said, we can't always identify the demands, and we can't always remove demands either, right? So if the demand is just being at school, then escape behavior may continue to occur and yet cannot really be reinforced until the end of the day, which creates a whole other set of problems. So that's our antecedent stuff that could be going on. And then on the consequent side, if we really want to address escape maintained behavior, then we could do escape extinction. To do that, you just keep presenting the demands, no matter what problem behavior presents itself. In some cases, that may be possible. In other cases, that may be impossible. Unpossible, as people sometimes don't say.
I like that.
It always makes it sound really easy, right? But it may not be the case. Escape extinction can be very, very effective if it's done with 100% integrity, but Keep in mind, whenever you're doing extinction, there's always potential for extinction bursts, so behavior could get worse before it gets better, and there is also the possibility of extinction-induced aggression as well. Again, my other point that I brought up previously, we're not teaching an appropriate replacement behavior, then we're taking away someone's voice and saying that they don't like to do a task or they don't want to engage in that task, and that is not ethical, so we should always be teaching an appropriate alternative response as well. So there's benefits on both sides there. What they wanted to do was figure out, can we make modifications to the antecedent conditions and reduce this type of escape-maintained SIB specifically in combination with extinction?
Right.
Right, we'll talk. I'm going to circle back to that, okay? There are 3 participants in this study. Mary was 3. She had severe developmental disabilities. She was blind. She had cerebral palsy, and she engaged in some pretty significant escape-maintained behavior, including headbanging, scratching, and eye poking. Wally was 17. He had profound developmental disabilities, and he engaged in self-hitting to the face, head, and legs. And then Lynn was 2. She had moderate developmental disabilities, and she engaged in hand biting.
But this is not a simple behavior. Like, this is pretty serious.
Oh, yeah. Yes, they all definitely warranted intervention.
Right, all 3 of these articles, I was like, whoo!
Mm-hmm.
We are getting at the big stuff.
They didn't do it for the kid who's like, I'm pouting. I don't like work.
Whining was defined as.
All right, so I don't have to tell you what happened in the FA. What do you think happened?
Standard
was demand conditions the highest rate of SIB or result in the highest rate of SIB? Yeah.
I believe there was a play condition.
Mm-hmm.
An attention condition.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do that, you hurt yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Remember in grad school we used to joke about that all the time.
Don't do that.
Yeah. Don't do that, you'll hurt yourself.
Stop, don't, come back.
Yeah.
And then we'd all giggle a little bit.
It sounds artificial. You have to make it much more real when you're doing sessions.
But it actually, I've said it a couple times in my life, in real life. Now, one for my child.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like,
but not in that type of voice.
No.
I'm like, don't.
Yeah. You're gonna hurt yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always try to make it like realistic if I'm running an FA.
Right. But yeah, just some standard.
Just the standard, not even the tangible. They just did the 4 conditions, and guess what? Behavior occurred almost exclusively in the demand condition, thereby leading the researchers to postulate that the behavior was maintained by escape.
I love the 90s research. I feel like the hallmark is, here's a long section describing an FA.
I know, right?
Now you're like, oh, yes, I read about 1,000 of these.
And
you can cut that out now.
It even said, you can see more in the...
Yeah, 8294.
And it wasn't even 94 yet. It was only the 82.
Oh.
So maybe that was why they needed to describe it in such
So
detail, because it hadn't even been republished in Java yet. Yeah, it was so detailed.
It's like a black and white movie. It's like, oh, add color already. Jeez.
I actually love that one because then I'm like, I am going to skip all this.
Yep.
3 pages. I'm not reading this. I've done an FA. Hooray.
So they determined that. And then they did a comparison between a couple conditions. The first was just a baseline condition, which was just like the FA, in which demands were presented. If problem behavior occurred, then escape was the consequence. They then did a combination of the following conditions for each participant. First was just straight up extinction, escape extinction, in which they continued to deliver instructions and physically guided through the tasks.
Sure.
And then there was an extinction plus fading condition. When initially, it was just as we've described, there were no instructions delivered initially. And then they increased by 1 demand per session as long as no SIB occurred. They did note in here, they're like, we didn't have a real particular schedule that we followed, right? It wasn't like one of those like percentile schedules where they were like really systematic in their approach. There was a little looser, a little bit play it by ear type of thing.
That's how life works though, unfortunately, sometimes.
Well, that's why it's so great reading for us, like this really is like an old article at this point. It's like 25 years old, reading like the old stuff like that, because they're like, let's just see what happens. Let's just see if this works.
I like
right?
that.
And like that's like the germ of research. That's like where it comes from. So I love that stuff too. And very important to note here, Jackie, extinction was still in place.
That's important to note.
I mean, I know it says it in the title, and I said extinction plus fading, but I just want to reiterate.
I think that's important too, because I think sometimes people forget. Right? I know when I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, it's working. But is it? Right?
Right.
We don't know.
Exactly.
Another thing I think is funny about all these articles, I'll just bring it up now, I was going to bring it up in my article, is that now I think we've been a little more concise with our treatments because we can just use the FA as the baseline, whereas they didn't. They did the FA, and then they just kept doing it for baseline.
Yeah.
For my article, anyway, they ran an FA, and then they ran conditions that were similar to the demand condition in the FA, but they didn't use the FA as the baseline, which they could have done, which now I think we're more likely to do.
Yeah.
We're very busy nowadays. In the 90s, you just had all kinds of time.
Well, I think it's now we're more thoughtful. Yeah, we're more thoughtful about time, right? Because we have a lot more
Streaming to watch.
there's more pressure, right, on everyone for instructional time to make sure that we're not spending undue time.
It's also a
doing
technology
research. Yeah.
that has been iterated on and iterated on and iterated on for over 20 years.
And maybe that's
Well, I think research culture builds upon itself as well.
Yeah.
So once one researcher said, "Oh, I'll just use that baseline again,"
everyone was like, "Genius!"
and that was published or they talked about it, they're like, "Oh yeah, let's all just do that."
Why
right?
haven't we been doing that?
Yeah. All right, so they had those 3 different conditions, but they were presented a little bit different for the different participants. So for Mary, they did initially a baseline, and then they moved to the extinction plus fading condition, straight up. For Wally, they did a baseline, then they did extinction plus fading, and then they did a reversal. So you had an AB-AB design.
Love it.
Back to baseline, back to extinction plus fading. And then for Lynn's the only one that they looked at extinction alone. So they did a baseline condition, then they did extinction, and then they moved her to the extinction plus fading condition.
What happened?
Let me tell you.
Okay.
So for all participants in baseline, the rate of SIB was high and variable, and the rate of instructions was high and a little bit variable, but mostly just high.
Okay. One thing I always like bringing up in this graph is you can see the instructions too. So there's SIB and the instructions. I got confused the first time I read it, and I was like, what does there look like if there's a cumulative record on this graph?
Right. But it is not.
It's not.
You think it is because it totally looks like a cumulative
It does,
record.
but it's not.
Right. So it's a double vertical axis graph. On one side, we have percentage of intervals with SIB, and on the other side, we have instructions per minute.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So the instructions are being tracked over there, and they range from 0 instructions per minute up to 3 instructions per minute. That was pretty much the max, and no one really ever got to 3. So we aren't talking about a fast-paced rate of instruction here. Even when they were back in place, it was just one every maybe 30 seconds was kind of like the end goal for them. But they slowly increased this over time. So for Mary, again, high rates in baseline, extinction plus fading wasn't implemented. Once the instruction rate dropped to 0, her SIB immediately dropped to 0 rates. She had some fluctuation as the rate of instruction was increased, but after many, many, many sessions, like this graph goes to 100 sessions. Once they got to around about 80 sessions, they were doing 2 instructions per minute, and her SIB was a little bit variable, but remained below 20% of intervals throughout. And that was her end goal. For Wally, high rates of SIB and baseline, they then did extinction plus fading, just like Mary. Immediate decrease to very low rates of behavior and very low rates of instruction. Return to baseline, saw an increase in the rate of SIB, but not as high as it was initially, but they did see some spikes in there. And high rates of instructions were provided. And then they went back to extinction plus fading. SIB remained very low throughout this entire condition, and they were able to fade up the number of trials per minute to around 2. And that took about 50 sessions for the last bout of extinction plus fading, just that part. And then finally for Lynn, we had an initial baseline with high rates of both things that we're tracking. Extinction, very high rates of instructions and variable rates of SIB. They then, after they did just extinction, her SIB was occurring at pretty high rates, so they then moved to the extinction plus fading condition. Here they saw a pretty dramatic decrease in rates of SIB when demands were lowered to 0, although it took a few sessions for that to happen. They then did a real quick reversal probe. They saw behavior pop right back up. It was only 3 sessions. Then they went back down and did sort of a more traditional extinction plus fading after that. They saw low rates of SIB and eventually got her up to about 2 instructions per minute as well. So that's what happened. And now we know. This was very effective for all 3 of these participants. It did take a long time.
Yeah.
Like I said, about 100 sessions. And the other thing that I just can't overstate enough is that extinction remained in place.
Right.
Throughout. And while rates of SIB were low during the extinction plus fading condition, they were not 0.
That's important.
So it was
to
not
know,
as
too.
though we faded and then we never saw the behavior occur again, right? And we, just slowly increased those demands and it was never ever a problem again. No, almost every session, some amount of SIB occurred for all 3 of these participants. And when it occurred, it was met with extinction, meaning the demands were continued to be presented. So we cannot, from this study, tease apart at all whether fading would have been effective without the extinction component in place.
Uh-oh.
Segue
Into my article.
Well, I do want to segue into your article, Jackie, but before we do that, let's take a little break, shall we? And then we'll be right back to talk more about instructional fading. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking all about instructional fading. And before I left everyone with that great cliffhanger of what would the research do after 1993's PACE article, we took our little break. And before we get back to that, I want to make sure that you all out there, if you don't already know, hear the great news. ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. Yes, by listening to this episode, you are able to earn continuing education credit. You just need to listen to the episode, go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs to apply for a continuing education credit for this episode. You're going to need 2 secret code words, though, so don't go quite yet. You want to finish listening to the episode and get those code words. I'm going to give you the first one now. It's nutrition. 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 Like you should eat healthy foods to make sure that you are engaged in a great nutrition practice.
I like eating bananas and oatmeal.
That's good for nutrition reasons.
Wow.
Should study nutrition in
Except
college.
that I mix in chocolate chips and then they melt into the oatmeal. It's delicious.
Yum, that
That
actually
is-
sounds really good. If
but
it's
not-
dark chocolate, it's fine.
It
Yeah.
might not be as
Cacao.
full of nutrition as you would like.
It's even fuller.
It's even fuller.
Cacao.
Nutrition. All right. So, Jackie, I kept everyone waiting. I'm sure they're on the edge of their seats. You know, they slammed on the brakes in their car. Maybe they went in the breakdown lane because they composed themselves because they can't wait to hear all about our next article by Zarcone et al. From 1994, talking about reemergence and extinction during instruction fading. So please tell us.
Yeah, this was like the Halloween where you're walking in the woods, because it's October, right? You're walking in the woods and you're like, what's coming? What's coming behind me? And you keep looking back. It's my article. Looking at you. Slowly walking toward you, but never quite reaching you.
That's creepy, man.
Thanks.
Like it follows?
Yeah.
So if you think that the authors of this article read like a veritable who's who of behavior analysis, you should read the credits of the people that helped but didn't even make it in the article.
I know, right?
Yeah.
This makes me jealous of life.
Wow.
From 1994.
What a powerhouse.
I love this article. The reasoning behind it really is research suggests that behavior will be eliminated, right? If we break that contingency between the behavior and the consequence. But we all know that that has some undesirable side effects like we talked about. They also mentioned some other antecedent manipulations that have been effective in the research in the past. One notably being when you are presented with difficult tasks, problem behavior might occur, but if you switch to more easy or maintenance type tasks, problem behavior may decrease immediately. So they said, maybe we don't really need to use extinction. Maybe that's all a facade. Maybe we can just use instructional fading.
I think you meant fallacy.
Yeah, probably.
A facade would be like, we put up a fancy picture so they couldn't see the demands behind it.
Yes, that's exactly what I meant.
That's a research idea. Put up a fancy picture so they won't see the demands coming.
This is just another antecedent manipulation, but they wanted to see, does it work without extinction being a part of it?
I think that's a great idea for an article. I mean, going back, because when you're reading through the PACE study, it's like, yes, this makes perfect sense, but there are a lot of settings where you're not going to get any social validity to, and we're going to take away all the demands for some period of time.
Right.
But we're just going to make the demands a little easier. Maybe that sounds promising.
I like that.
Might have the same effects. That's a good thing to explore.
But sometimes you also need to have harder demands, right? Because you got to teach things, so they may have to be hard.
That's true. But I think there's more tolerance for going from hard demands to easy demands temporarily than hard demands to no demands.
Right.
Or, God forbid, easy demands to no demands.
But they, in this
From
article...
a social validity perspective?
In a social validity
Okay.
perspective,
Gotcha.
yes.
Yeah, so they went over that, but in this article, they did not use easy demands. They went from hard demands to no demands, but they didn't use extinction.
Oh, I thought they
But it was
did.
just an idea.
It was just an idea.
Right.
Oh, I thought they did.
Sorry, yeah, no.
I'm forgetting.
Yeah, that's okay.
No, I thought it was a good point, too, because then when they said, like, oh, we've just been talking about fading rate of demand, but not about difficulty. I was like, what?
But there has been other articles that have looked at that, hard and easy demands, and they have shown that, but they didn't pair it with instructional fading. So that would be next time. Someone has probably done it since this was the 90s. What they're looking at is instructional fading effective without extinction? One caveat to note, though, is that if SIB was occurring at a specific rate that they talk about, they did implement extinction because they're like, we can't just let them hurt themselves.
No.
So similar to Diana's article, the participants in this study all were diagnosed with an intellectual disability, and they had very low levels of functioning, very few skills, and pretty significant challenging behavior. All of them are adults, which I like, because usually younger children are participating.
Yeah, and that means that there's a longer history.
Right. So all in their 30s and early 40s. Kate engaged in face hitting, Chris engaged in head banging, and Jesse engaged in a variety of face hitting, head banging, and pinching his body, which is not great. So these sessions were 15 minutes in length, and they were conducted 3 to 5 times per day, 5 days a week, and they usually had a break between 10 to 15 minutes within them. So that can be a pretty lengthy session, right? If you think about it, if they're running 5 times per day at 15 minutes, math, it's like over an hour.
75.
Yeah, so it's a little over an hour.
Plus the 10 to 15 minutes in between, which basically doubles it. So.
Yeah. So
it's like 2.5 hours.
They're really doing it. So they did note that sessions were terminated and responses were blocked if participants produced an open injury. They said this rarely occurred, but they made that noted, which I like, right? Because the original Iwata article suggested that we should have termination and talk about what that is. They had pretty high IOA, above 90%. So the sessions here, again, surprisingly, they did the standard FA, which consisted of attention, alone, escape, and play.
Shocking.
Yep. And for results here, all the participants had higher rates in the demand condition during the FA. Also not shocking, right? Because that's
I
what we're
can't
looking
believe
at.
it.
Kate and Chris only responded in the escape conditions, whereas Jesse responded across all the conditions, but was higher and had no overlapping points in that demand condition. So the baseline again was identical to the demand condition. and they provided around 2 instructional tasks per minute. When you look at the graph, instructions are really high because they're engaging in a lot of instructions. And then instructional fading conditions, they started by taking away all the instructional tasks and gradually reintroducing them if SIB was less than 0.5 responses per minute across 2 sessions. So unlike your article, they had a very specific criteria when they were going to increase and decrease. Here, escape was still an option, right? So if they engaged in SIB, they could escape from those tasks. So they kept going with the instructional fading until task equated the baseline, which was around 2 instructions per minute, or 30 across the 5 minutes. If SIB reemerged, they would decrease those instructional tasks and add in this extinction component if participants did not meet the criteria after 10 consecutive sessions. Right? So
Thank you for that technological summary.
You're welcome. And so I think that's important to note here. So they placed participants' behavior on extinction until SIB was below that criteria, and then extinction was removed and instructional fading without extinction was resumed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I liked that.
It made sense, yeah.
It did make sense. So they're like, oh, we're going to get this under control, and then let's see if it works.
Mm-hmm.
That was a little confusing to me when I read it the first time. I read this as a master's student, and then when I read it again, I was like, oh, yes, now that makes sense. So what they found was that during baseline, instructions were high, and SIB ranged between 2.3 and 6.4 responses per minute, where Kate had the highest instances of SIB, and Chris had the lowest. Jesse had moderate amount. So the circles show the addition of the instructions into the conditions. So just like Diana's, it does look like a cumulative record, but it is not.
Right.
But it's just showing us the gradual increase in where they had to halt for those 10 sessions where SIB wasn't meeting the criteria, and then they might have to implement extinction. Extinction was needed for all of the participants, unfortunately. It was needed for Kate and Chris 4 times, and it was needed for Jesse 4 times, and then through the entire end of the conditions. Similar to Diana's, but a little bit worse, this took an amazing amount of time. So in order to get to those 30 instructions per 5 minutes, Kate needed 194 sessions. What's 194 times 15? A lot.
I don't know.
A lot of
I can't
minutes.
do that one
right?
in my head.
Chris needed 129 sessions, and he ended with the extinction in effect as well. And Jesse needed 190 sessions. So that's kind of a bit of sessions.
Yeah.
Hopefully this wasn't someone's master's thesis. But as I'm thinking of how many
It was a dissertation.
Oh, good. Right?
It was Jen Zarcone.
Oh, good. Right?
Dissertation.
And so what they said in these results was that the good thing, there's like good, bad things, right? So like the good thing is everyone started off not needing escape extinction. They got to a point where then responding started to deteriorate, right? So maybe there was more tasks. And so that's when you saw
finally more demands, right?
And you're
Yeah.
like, ooh, this is not what I love. Jesse made it the farthest, so he got around 1.53 responses per minute, around 20 per session. So he was really close.
Yeah.
And so after extinction was implemented, it was needed during every increase in instructional tasks for him. Instructional fading worked initially, right? But then as tasks became maybe more complex and longer, and there was more tasks, then it broke down. So that was sad, but necessary.
Well, I think it just speaks to what you have going on here when you're looking at escape maintained behavior, right? You can do a lot on the establishing operation side, but when you get to a certain point, it's like flipping a switch, when you're like, we've all been there, right?
Oh,
you're
yeah.
like, this isn't fun anymore, and this isn't what I thought it was going to be, and I don't want to do it.
Right.
Like once you get there, you're done. And that's kind of how it is with instructional fading too, right? You're like, I will tolerate you asking me these things as long as
until the moment, yeah.
Right? But then when I'm done, I am done.
Right. And so for these 3 participants, the loss of control occurred between 0.5 responses per minute and 1.5 responses per minute. So there wasn't really even like a the similar response per minute, which makes sense because everyone's different, right?
Yeah.
But one important note that they pointed out is that for 2 of the participants, each time extinction was implemented, it took less time for problem behavior to decrease, with the exception of Jesse. But that's something good to note, too. So if you were going to replicate this, maybe you couldn't always do extinction, right? But you wanted to do the instructional fading piece until responding broke down and SIB reemerged, that it might take less and less time each time that you do it. And again, in this instance that we talked about before, an alternate response was not taught. And they posited that it might be important to use extinction when teaching an appropriate response to replace the problem behavior, but that was just a thought.
Right, they didn't do that.
They didn't do that. But those are the things that they said that further down the line, this should happen. Talk about reinforcement. Talk about what other things we could do to make this even better.
And Zarcone's like, I'm done.
Right?
I am done with this dissertation. Someone else can ask that question.
Throwing a mic. Yeah.
All right. Well, so we've talked a lot about instructional fading and escape extinction. We talked about how you can use instructional fading on its own. You can use it in concert with escape extinction. So let's continue with that question of, could we do instructional fading with reinforcement? And so that's what the Ringdahl et al. 2002 paper will discuss. And I don't know about you guys, but were you amazed at how many authors worked on a paper that is like 4 pages long?
Yeah, I did love that.
Wow, this really got
quite a crew.
All hands on deck for that one. It was such a short, sweet paper. Looking at this article and looking at instructional fading, to start off, there had prior to 2002 been a Piazza, Mose, and Fisher study back in 96 looking at reducing destructive behavior with a participant in which there was a DRA procedure used paired with escape extinction with no physical guidance and some instructional fading. So there had been previous research looking at pairing reinforcement with instructional fading and escape extinction and seeing, good results with that one participant. But again, the question you then have is, okay, well, did you have to do instructional fading, or is that really just sort of this extraneous piece of what is otherwise just a DRA procedure? So let's do research and let's figure out the answer to that. Can we use a DRA package with and without instructional fading, and will we see different results? Is our big research question here. The researchers had one participant. Again, they couldn't find more than one participant between these 2 studies. You only had 2. But hey,
well, that's why it was only a 3-page report.
Yes, that's true. I don't know if it would have been that much longer with multiple participants, perhaps. So they had a 9-year-old girl with autism and problem behavior that had been determined to be maintained by escape from instruction.
Just keep in mind, Rob, there's no brief studies, only brief reports.
There was a fancy data program that they used in this article. I can't remember the name of it offhand, and I didn't put it on my notes, but they were very, very excited to have this sort of like real-time data collection system to look at
the Observe program.
The Observe program. I wonder if that is still a program one could use today, or if it is
probably not. Would be my guess.
Out of print. You got to run an emulator and use DOS to get that one running anymore. It would record, pretty much real-time record, the number of responses per minute of problem behavior, the percentage of session time with problem behavior. So destruction and aggression and SIB were all the problem behaviors that were tracked, as well as the number of academic instructions presented, per minute. It was a multi-element design, so we had 2 different settings in which this participant was either receiving a DRA with instructional fading or a DRA without instructional fading program. If the treatment was without instructional fading, it was run in her typical classroom. So it was about a 30 to 60 minute session, depending on whatever was going on in the day, and it was her actual teacher running the sessions. When the treatment was run with instructional fading, it was run in a separate therapy room, and that was always 45 minutes, because one of the nice things about being in a therapy room is you have complete control of the environment for however long you've decided to be in there.
Unless someone comes in.
And it was a behavior therapist running the sessions, which again, this kind of comes back again in the limitations of 2 different people, how much more training you probably would need to do the instructional fading. So, the same tasks were used, the same leisure materials were present, so all that stuff was the same across both environments. So when instructional fading was not present, so DRA without instructional fading, the participant was presented with an instruction about every other minute. If she was compliant with the instruction, she received a 1-minute break with access to various leisure items. If problem behavior were presented, then another instruction would be presented. If anything in the environment was destroyed, the student would have to restore the environment as needed. If they had problem behavior during a break, they'd end the break, restore the environment, and then present another instruction. So pretty standard procedure there. When instructional fading was in place, there were no instructions delivered the first 3 sessions of treatment. And then gradually the instruction rate was increased by 1 instruction per 15 minutes. Sorry, I should say that was the first rate of instruction, was 1 per 15 minutes in that 45-minute chunk of time.
I can handle that.
And there'd be 1 more instruction added for each 45-minute session in which there was no problem behavior. So that's a long session. But again, at least you kind of know the students got something to do because the leisure items were all right there. And the evaluation ended completely when the rate of instruction was the same in both environments. So we're starting with no instruction at all in the instruction fading condition, instructions presented about 1 every minute, and whenever you got to them to the magical same amount, research is over. Look at the results.
Ta-da!
So what were those results? Well, let's look at the overall rate of problem behavior when the fading procedure was not in place. Problem behavior started off high, as you would expect, based on the results of the initial FA. And then over time, the rate of problem behavior decreased down to about 0.2 responses of problem behavior per minute. Across the last 3 sessions, you see instruction rate, delivery, and compliance at about 0.5 instructions per minute. In comparison, when DRA was paired with the instruction fading, you had a low rate of problem behavior all the way through your sessions. There were really only 2 sessions that they even noted any problem behavior occurring across that entire component of the study. There were 0 rates of problem behavior across the last 3 sessions run, and that was when they reached that same 0.5 instructions per minute rate. So the rate of instructions were the same across both. I guess if you have to compare the 2 of them, they both ended up in the same space in terms of how many instructions were being presented per minute. However, if I had to choose between no problem behavior at all and a lot, and then over time a decrease in problem behavior, but never to quite as low as in the other condition, I will choose the demand fading procedure, or the demand fading addition to my DRA program. Now, why would this happen, you might ask? Well, there are a couple thoughts as to why that could have been. It may have been satiation. Was the student just had so much time in which they did absolutely no work that the MO for behavior that would lead to escape just dropped off the map? That certainly could be. Was it that as those initial instructions were presented, the response effort was so low that the student could be successful, and they met the reinforcement so quickly that they just realized, oh, these instructions aren't so bad, my responding is getting reinforced all the time, and they were just able to build up this nice history of reinforcement in a very straightforward and easy fashion? That certainly could be. Who knows? Not sure which one between the 2 of them. Again, our limitations is now we've got 2 participants who've used DRA and some sort of a demand fading. So that's, not quite enough to put your generality flag in there. And there's also the big issue of the student was in 2 very different environments with 2 different teachers. Mm-hmm. So how much of the treatment was successful due to just a difference in location? We had 2 different, we had a teacher and we had a behavior therapist. Was there some sort of a reinforcement history developed with the behavior therapist? Is it the first time they met the behavior therapist and the very first thing they said was play for the next 45 minutes? Whereas maybe they had a relationship with the teacher that was work for the next 45 minutes.
Right.
So that's a confound. I always understand when you have your different environments and your different therapists to try to help with discrimination for your participant, but you then do run into that confound of, well, how much did the setting have to do with these results? And there's no way to figure it out. And that was my short but sweet study for today.
But I think it really rounds it out, right? Because it addresses the limitation of ours.
Yep.
In a way.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of done like a nice review of some of the general components of demand fading, why don't we head into dissemination station? Talk about demand fading in the future. So I think we've already brought up one of the questions that we have of, do we have to do demand fading as a zero baseline kind of setup of we're taking away all the demands? Or can we find some sort of magic balance of present demands before escape maintain problem behavior occurs?
I hope it's magic.
It's probably magic.
In a world where you are held accountable for acquisition of certain skills for students, right? As teachers and as behavior analysts, it's really difficult to justify instructional fading a lot of the times. I remember one time I really wanted to do it, and I got a lot of pushback because it, like we all have found out, it takes a long time, right? And it may or may not get you to where you want to be, so you have to be really sure. So I think it would be really cool if there was research supporting, there is some, but like more research supporting that, just transitioning from difficult to easier tasks may be beneficial. I think it would be really cool if someone could develop an assessment that would tell us if instructional fading would work, right? Is it just getting used to the demands that's going to help us, right, decrease problem behavior, or is there something else about the demands that are so aversive?
I want to see like a longitudinal study
with
some of these, because there's always that talk of like, oh, maybe they've just contacted enough reinforcement and their history of following demand behavior has been reinforced so much. I want to see the numbers on that, because it's one thing to say, oh, we have 0 rates of problem behavior and the student will now do
everything,
half an instruction per minute. I know that's not what it was, but that rate of 0.5 per minute, that's really low. And if this is a student who has severe disabilities, it's going to be hard for them to learn all of the skills they need to learn when they're not even following one instruction on average every minute.
Yeah.
That's very few instruction trials per day. So you kind of say, but no problem behavior. Maybe it'll get better over time. I want to see that it gets better over time.
I want the hashtag it gets better to apply to instructional fading.
It's a different thing entirely.
I know.
But it may depend, too, on the type of demands that we're talking about, right? So, like, if you're at your vocational job, then maybe one demand every minute is not unreasonable, depending on what type of demand it is. I also have to say, personally, I think that one demand every minute is the worst possible schedule of demands. I would rather have constant demands.
Yes.
That then had an end than just one every minute. 'Cause I'm pretty sure that's the schedule that I'm currently on.
Well, you sort of always look, I love reading research and saying, wow, great results. I could use this. And then you have to stop and say, wait a minute. They did this for 45 minutes. I am going to be working with an individual for maybe 6, 8, maybe 10, 12 hours. So what works for 45 minutes doesn't necessarily work for an entire day's worth of activities. That 1 minute of instruction and no problem behavior, that might be good for 45 minutes, but what about 50 minutes, 60 minutes, if you're still going with your responses? And I know no one works nonstop, but we all take little breaks every now and again, certainly. Still, over time, is there a cumulative effect of some of those demands? I also want to bring up, as much fun as instructional fading is, I'm thinking about my life as a concurrent chains kind of preference assessment. When I'm faced with escape maintained behavior, and I've got my initial link is choosing functional communication training or demand fading, and my terminal link might be exactly the same, which is some amount of work is completed, 0 rates or low rates of problem behavior, I think I would always go to FCT, because there's more of a sense of I am teaching a skill right off the bat that is going to be useful across lots of settings, hopefully, versus demand fading, where you're removing some sort of stimulus, then you're slowly adding it back in. Maybe you're building up a tolerance or a better history of reinforcement, depending on what type of procedure you're also kind of pairing with your instructional fading. No thanks. I think I'll take my FCT and then maybe do some delay tolerance training.
Sure. Yeah, and that's been a more recent addition to our literature, is delay and denial tolerance training. And I think that it fits in pretty nicely with this. So I've almost always seen demand fading done in the context of also teaching functional communication response, or the client already knowing one, right? So maybe you get some work done, but then if they ask to take a break, then they can take a break. And if they continue asking for that break, they can continue to take that break. But then suddenly you have a break situation that's happening for 6 hours. And then that's when you're like, okay, well, basically we've gone to 0 demands on its own. How are we going to build some instruction time back in while still honoring this response that this person clearly values a lot? And that's when you can start to look at delay and denial tolerance training, right? Say, oh yeah, you can take a break after we do this one little thing, or in a minute, right? So starting to build in that. So taking a look at some of Greg Hanley's work in that regard at practicalfunctionalassessment.com might be of interest to folks.
And I always when I think about instructional fading or when I've ever tried to do in the past, it's hard to promote buy-in because nobody wants to not teach, right? Because we're all here to teach and to do things. So when you tell someone, I don't want you to give demands, they're like, I'm just going to slip a demand.
Yeah.
I'm just going to slip one and it'll be fine, right? So I think it's harder to have good integrity in that procedure, in my experience, right? That I don't have any... I don't have any, like, objective data to support this, but I just know that when I've done it in the past, like, I've seen staff, like, slip a demand in here and there, and I'm like, what are you doing? And they're like, but it's fine. It's fine. You know, like, whispering, like, it's just one. I'm like, yeah, but you don't know. Yeah, it's not the point. Right. So I think I see where your point is, too, right? About, at least with the FCT, you're doing something appropriate. And sometimes if you're not in your situation, right, where you're already back there, and you're like, I'm going to take everything out and we're going to slowly get back in, you might not get buy-in from your staff.
Yeah.
Yeah, just something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't, and I was like, why? And I was like trying to like make like binders and PowerPoint presentations, but.
All right. So some thoughts on instructional fading. An interesting procedure, interesting treatment. Perhaps been somewhat superseded by a couple other treatments nowadays. But hey, that's sort of for up to decide. Can we think of any cases where you would really want to focus on doing instructional fading rather than looking at, say, FCT? Like, is there a hypothetical time when, this probably would make more sense for this learner?
No, you should always do FCT.
Right. I think it should be an and. Right? These are experimental studies. So I don't think anyone should replicate these for replication's sake, right? I think
no, but I'm thinking. Okay.
I'm saying this worked, even though it took a long time. It worked. I'm going to do it in my classroom. This is not that article that you do that with.
No, but I'm just wondering, like, would there be a situation where, like, for some reason we can't do FCT, but we need to do something else? I mean, I'm really can't think of any situation.
No.
I've seen FCT occur, certainly in research, but even in my own practice with students who have very little, if any, verbal behavior, but they're able to pick up FCT, to high-functioning students who are able to learn really elaborate FCT repertoires. All right. Well, Jackie, Diana, thanks so much for being here again tonight to talk about this cool research, another treatment for us all to have.
You're welcome.
You really are welcome.
Thank you. We hope that you also enjoyed being here, and we thank you for listening. If you liked the show, please feel free to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can certainly subscribe to it as well. We would love to have our show visit your phone or whatnot every week. You can find us on social media everywhere as ABA Inside Track. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. Pinterest especially, we put out really cool, or Diana puts out really cool infographics which describe summaries of some of our shows. So if you're new to the show, why not take a look at those on Pinterest and see if there are any topics that would interest you. You can also find all of these posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitle feature, and of course find all of these posted online at abainsidetrack.com. And if you have any feedback or topic ideas for us, or just want to say hi, please do so anytime you like at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Oh, wait, one last thing before we go. If you also were listening because you'd like some continuing education credits, you better get that second secret code word. I'm going to give it to you right now. It's Bobble, Bobble. It's the second part of the hit Nintendo game Bubble Bobble. Remember Bubble Bobble, guys? That should be our closing music, but I don't have it handy.
Or like a bobblehead.
Or like a bobblehead, I guess. If you're not cool like me and want to talk about old Nintendo games.
Tom Brady bobblehead.
Bobble. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!